Welcome to Better Than We Found It, the podcast for leaders driven to leave a positive mark through their leadership.
I hope that I will have created some ways in which the circumstances of your birth don't predict the opportunities you have in your life.
I'm Josh Huggins, your host and the founder of GS2 Partnership, a search firm committed to connecting visionaries dedicated to environmental and social betterment.
I have two young sons. I want to be able to tell them I did use the resources and expertise of a company to try to create more awareness about climate change.
In each episode, we delve into the minds of executive and future leaders. We discuss how sustainability guides responsible leadership, sparks change, and drives value.
The way of thinking I try and advocate is for us all to think about us having a collective problem to fix, which is climate, and that we need to rebuild our global economy.
We are GS2, and we are on a critical journey to connect to those who believe in leaving the world better than we found it. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Better Than We Found It. On today's show, it's a great honour to have my guest today, Jim Massey, who is currently the Chief Sustainability Officer at Zylab, but also well known as a best-selling author for his book Trust in Action, The Leader's Guide to Act Right Now. Trust in Action is a book for business leaders who want to create a better world and know that working together is what makes it happen. And I think that fundamentally is what underpins why Jim is such a great guest for Better Than We Found It. Leading with purpose and doing so in a time where individuals, employees are losing trust and faith in organisations, and how he, within his executive capacity, has helped shape and deliver sustainable transformation within the large global corporates that he's worked for. So I hope you enjoyed the show. There's a huge amount of wisdom. I love Jim's energy and enthusiasm for the subject. And I'm sure you will get so much from it. So let's dive right in. So Jim, welcome to Better Than We Found It.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate the invite and I'm excited to speak with you.
Brilliant. So I've done a little introduction to you before we started speaking today, but I think for those in the audience who perhaps don't know who you are, it'd be great to give a bit of an introduction to yourself, to Zylab, and I suppose your current role and remit right now.
I think the best way to understand, an introduction of me is to understand I'm a behaviorist. All my life, I've been studying human behavior and trying to influence it, whether it was early on in politics or in consumer marketing, where I learned the importance of how to position a concept to influence human behavior. And then I spent almost 15 years on the governance side of organizations, changing human behavior for good. In the last decade, I've really been focused on changing human behavior for good and impact. And it's good impact along the way. And so, I'm an author of Trust in Action. My family and I are best-selling authors of another book on setting big goals and achieving them as a family through a family travel book. And we all speak on multiple topics. And I'm a passionate advocate of innovation and change. And I'm currently the Chief Sustainability Officer at Zylab, a biotech company that works to bring innovation out of China to the rest of the world and commercialize key products to help those patients in Greater China and around the world.
Fantastic. So I'm keen to hear about how this all came to be. So tell me a bit about your upbringing. I know on the call before we recorded this that you spoke to me about growing up in rural Mississippi. So tell me, Missouri, I should say. So tell me a bit about that, what that was like, and how I suppose those early years formed your view of nature, environment, and society.
Yeah, Josh, growing up in rural Missouri, it was for me looking back, it was an iconic, wonderful childhood. We grew up on 40 acres. We had horses and chows and cattle and sheep, but it wasn't for the income, is what many would call like a gentleman's farm. My dad wanted to stay active because he grew up on a large farm in southern Missouri. This allowed him to have his corporate job and have something in the evenings. And so, when we get into trouble, we would always be forced to go out and grab dirt, a blade of grass, and touch bark. And, us kids never understood that. As a parent, now I understand the trees were far away, so we had to run and burn energy. And so it's just a way to get us out. And we always came back much calmer. And so I think those are the pieces of understanding the nature and balance of nature with humanity were early embedded into my brain on the importance. And it wasn't until much later that I started to learn how I played in that world as both a leader, but also as someone who was walking around in systems that were built for him. And so I think, as we keep going, I've spoken a lot about the environmental side, but growing up in rural Missouri, I wasn't exposed to a lot of diversity. And so coming out into the world, I didn't appreciate how power systems had been built for generations and how I benefited from those and the role I played in them. And that has been a significant part of my leadership journey, especially in the corporate world.
For sure. So let me just get into the farm. I have to pick up on something you said there. So it was a farm, but it was an evening job. So, I know people that grew up on farms and how hard that work is. So, that must have been, were you roped into doing lots of duties, or how did that work?
So just for perspective, my partner, Emily, she grew up on a hog operation in northern Iowa. And she had to get up at 5 a.m. before going to school. She was one of two kids. She and her sister would wash the hog bins every morning before going to school. So when she hears me say I grew up on a farm, she's like, no, you grew up in the country. Let's be very clear. So my biggest chore is chows eat until they're full and then they stop. So I would have to feed the dog. We could put feeders out, and every fourth Sunday I had to feed them. So it's kind of like, no. So for those listening, don't think that I was putting on bibs and birthing calves. That wasn't it. It was just, we lived out in the country and happened to have some acreage where we could have farm animals for fun.
Sure. Okay. Understood. Good to clarify. So yes.
If my wife hears this, she would want to add a disclaimer.
Yeah, for sure. So, so you mentioned to me that your career started, or was, I suppose, came to prominence through a political campaign in your third grade. Do you mind sharing the story with me and how that experience?
So my maternal grandfather was very active in politics, especially on the policy side, and I just remember through different contacts and networks walking a parade, handing out things for someone running for re-election, Kirkpatrick, and handing out the fans at the parade. And that's a vivid memory. And from there, it just kept me focused on, I think that's maybe what I want to do, and when I talk about studying human behavior, a little kid getting to hand stuff out was pretty fun. And, that led to continuing to do activities throughout my educational, high school. I was lobbying at Congress for, the U.S. Congress for alternative funding for different types of education. There weren't many people going to college out of my high school because they were going to trade programs. And that's a very respectful career and can do equally successful. But at the time, they were cutting that funding. So at age 16, I was working with the Joseph Kennedy and the Whitney Houston Foundation to come lobby in Washington, D.C. to get more funding for the Student Bill 1990. And that work just kept going until I found myself leaving presidential personnel at age 22, thinking, I don't want to do this long term. And so then I had to start to pivot. And that's how I got into leveraging my undergraduate degree of marketing, working for Johnson & Johnson in sales and marketing for a decade.
Sure. So what was the pivot that made you realize that perhaps policy or politics wasn't where you felt that your purpose was, having, at an even younger age, felt that it could be?
The irony is that I thought policy was boring, that policy wasn't enough to change the behavior. There were other ways you could do it more effectively. The reason I say ironically is because now I talk about ESG. When everyone says we need regulations, I tell them in the polarized world in which we operate, we will never have the regulations required for the action needed. And so even at that early age, there was something in me saying, this is not going to be the game-changing, world-transformative work I want to do. And lo and behold, it's March Heck's Law I write about in my book and talk a lot about. technology is changing so rapidly, we as individuals can react faster than the systems in which we have come to rely, including business and government. And so I still have so many of my friends saying, we need policy, we need policy. We're never going to get it. And so are we going to keep waiting and allow ourselves to be on the joint suicide mission of killing the planet? Or are we as leaders going to start taking the action required before we get the polarized governments to take the action needed? So
for sure,
it's fascinating for me to look back and see at that moment something was telling me this doesn't seem right, and then to have it play out that I trusted my gut for a reason.
Understood. So these early years in Johnson & Johnson was down the marketing lens. So what were those roles? What did they entail? Was sustainability on the agenda or in any form back then?
Not really, right? This was in the early 2000s. We were beginning to think about the extra packaging. From a waste perspective, we wanted to minimize waste in production. But it was really, those years were formulative in being able to take a concept. I was working on some of the world's most trusted brands at one of the world's most trusted companies. And so I understood the importance of the power of what you were presenting and how you communicated it to draw the human behavior the direction we wanted. So I was working on brands like Tylenol, Imodium, Motrin. I ended up relaunching one of the most iconic brands here in the United States called St. Joseph Aspirin. It was a pediatric aspirin. And what I was asked to do was bring it forward to the baby boomers who knew it as a pediatric medicine, but now needed it for their heart health. And the complexity of bringing aspirin into paracetamol or acetaminophen is the monograph product of Tylenol. And there are books written about the war of Tylenol and aspirin. And I was brought in to bring them together into a company that said, no, you're bringing the enemy to us. So that's when I started to understand, when people understand why it's happening, the behavior will change more rapidly. So I went and talked to the plant to explain, yes, you've thought it's been bad, but this is the good part of it. And when we do this, we are actually protecting the Tylenol brand even further. It ended up being at the time the fastest commercial launch in Johnson & Johnson's consumers' history and one of its most successful to date. And so that's where I start, that's where I hone the skill of there are ways of communicating why something matters to change behavior swiftly.
Sure, understand. And I suppose that change of behavior and then leading to transformation has been a key factor of your career that's kind of followed you. Moving on to your next organization with MedImmune, you mentioned that you spearheaded this global transformation around compliance. What were some of the insights you think that you learned from your time at J&J that you took into that transformation, but perhaps also the things that maybe you got wrong or that you learned from when transferring it to another business?
Yes. When I joined MedImmune, they were a small biotech company looking to build out its compliance function. And I learned, what I brought with me is, instead of doing what everyone else was, how could we learn from the mistakes they had made? And so it was trying to build a compliance program that empowered the business to operate at the speed of business and at the place of business, not to come ask compliance, is this okay for us to do? So it was empowering the business to understand the right way and enable it to do it faster. And, so what we did is we minimized the rules we wrote. We focused on principles. And at the time, it was significant because in industry, that's when so many of the corporate integrity agreements from the Department of Justice were being handed out to pharma companies for what was considered by the government off-label promotion. And it's only in the U.S. where this happens, because it's predominantly in the U.S. where you can have direct consumer interactions and communications. The rest of the world, you cannot. So long story short, it was less is more, still focusing on the why and providing the clarity over the certainty. Here's what you cannot do versus why are you doing that? And what's the end goal? What's the benefit to the patients and the organization? If we can justify it, we can always find a way. But it's got to be the right way, not just to make more money, right? That's sure. What the government was concerned about with and exploiting taxpayer dollars. And so when we later got acquired by AstraZeneca, the large multinational pharmaceutical company, they asked me to start with the US, and start working there. And then I ended up taking on the global. And it was always, the key concepts I speak a lot about is I provide clarity over certainty. The moment you are certain about something in today's fast changing world, you're outdated. So you need clarity of where you're going. And I empower people to make decisions instead of enforce them to follow my rules. And those are significant transformations for the compliance industry that ended up getting me recognized in 2019 as one of the top minds in compliance. The work I did is I removed, we had a code of conduct that was 30 pages. I took it down to 1. And I crowdsourced from the employees. I empowered them to tell me what are the 5 values and the 10 behaviors you think we need to hold ourselves accountable to. And that was the premise of our code of conduct that then allowed us to find out the right policies to enable and empower the right action. And that's it. So when I provide clarity and empower the people, we get the action instead of oscillation that slows business down.
For sure. And I can clearly already start to see these parallels that I'm sure you've been drawing off in the move to sustainability and empowering and embedding this within organizations. It almost feels like, I know the end of the story before you're going to tell it, but you can see how it's building to that journey. Something that I think, I don't think you've mentioned the direct word, but you're certainly talking about here is around culture. And building the right culture and understanding that. I suppose a question that I'm quite keen to understand for listeners who are perhaps moving from maybe a country or region to that global basis is, how did you learn, understand, navigate that step up from something which was perhaps cultures or a culture or cultures you understood well to some perhaps that were far-flung and not so well known to you, to ensure that you're still delivering what's needed?
Absolutely. And Josh, the irony is, as I kept moving, I kept having people tell me, you need to learn hello in the native language. You need to, understand the customs. I remember thinking that feels almost like an appropriation. I don't speak the language, right? And it was always a very fine line for me. But what I would go into, in my study of human nature and my limited time at that moment, my limited exposure, was kindness worked a lot for me. Unconditional love that people are uncomfortable with, but a curiosity to learn about. And instead of enforcing I knew it, I had the clarity that I needed to ask. And so I would find allies within that area to help me understand it more. So it really was through a humility that I didn't know it all. And, you can't see this on here, but I am 6'4". I'm a stout guy, right? No one ever confuses me for being European, Asian, or the suave Latin American guy, right? I just kind of scream Midwest American. And so by owning my identity and accepting the humility that I'll never fully walk a mile there, I ask the questions. And that, I believe, is what has allowed me to be successful in the human connection that we create the business structure together. So I never came in and said, this is it. But I always challenge, why are we doing it this way? What more can we do to empower the people and provide the clarity they need to do the action that's expected of them? And that time and time again kept replicating to the point now where it's just a partnership. And I understand the common human traits that go throughout the world are not culturally different in any region of the world. My family and I have traveled to all 50 states and we've been on all 7 continents. And I teach my boys, go with humility, kindness, and unconditional love, and learn how you can fit in. It's not that the world needs to fit around you.
For sure, understood. So where did the transition from it being a compliance focus to something that was broader in terms of sustainability or environment? Where did that come from? Could you tell us about that journey for you?
So it started off that the executive team at AstraZeneca was very pleased with the compliance work. I was able to transform an organization that was at odds and at fighting. And again, I keep thinking about my Johnson & Johnson days. I come into places where people are fighting and help through that clarity to just say, we're on the same team. We're wanting the same goals. And so since I had done that, in 2015, there was this emerging sustainability push, especially coming from Europe for multinational organizations. And so we had people who had been working on aspects of sustainability, but they were focused on the raters and rankers, just, trying to get a certain score, never looking at culture. And so since I had done such a cultural transformation, both functionally and enterprise-wide, that's when they asked me, will you take on and build this out to be broader? And it ended up parlaying me into being one of the 10 senior leaders who was developing the long-term strategy for the organization, empowering employees to engage. We had more than, at the time, I think we had like 20,000 employee engagements with actually employees engaged with multiplied numbers of engagements. So we really were grassroots building a program. We had internal social media where I would go on and say, we need to address this. What are your thoughts? And inevitably, they came from someone at the front lines of business, not the C-suite. And so talk about being able to empower employees to bring action forward. One of my favorite projects was AZ Forest. It's where we launched it with our one of the world's first net zero programs the team and I designed. And it came when an employee knew she could not get an electric car for years, but she said, I know there's one thing I can do. I can plant a tree in my backyard. And she challenged me. And from there, the employees started planting trees. We got up to like 50,000 trees just with employees. So then I worked with the executive team to commit to doing 50 million around the world. And now that's up to 200 million, all because one employee tagged me on our internal social media post saying, we can take action this way. And so it started, they asked me to build it. They first gave me the environmental health and safety team. And I started working with facilities there. And then it grew into the social aspect. I had responsibility for Healthy Heart Africa, our way in which we were able to address equity in low to middle income countries. And then, of course, I still had my role with the code of conduct and the governance aspect of the program itself.
For sure. And you also mentioned the Lead with Health program. Was that part of one of those? Was that the overarching strategy? It was the first real strategy we had for sustainability. In the past, it was always just environment. And no, that's an existential threat to all of us. My big thing is AstraZeneca does not extract. We aren't in transportation and shipping. We're not in agriculture. Our products aren't primarily derived from agriculture. So, what I'm describing are the 20 industries that do more than 80 to 90% of greenhouse gas emissions. That wasn't us. And so I realized I had to get us focused. And that's really a lot of what I do now. Is it's easy to have the white noise of all stakeholders tell you, you need to work on biodiversity, you need to do this. We're a health company. And so I help organizations, and this is what I started doing at AstraZeneca. Where can we make our dent in the universe? It's not in climate. Now we ended up doing it, but there's a business reason for that. But I had to get us focused on our SDG was number 3, health and well-being. In particularly, it was 3.4 and 3.5 indicators with the targets of eliminating non-communicable and communicable diseases. Getting laser focused on why you exist is how you make the biggest impact. And then you're not allowed to do bad in the other areas. And that's where doing good and changing human behavior for good is how we ended up being one of the first companies to develop the net zero program that everyone talks about today. Sure. So I suppose it'd be great to get your perspective on the challenges that you faced when you looked at being quite specific with the areas, because I suppose as you mentioned, there is a lot of white noise out there around the other areas of sustainability that are needed. And for less informed executives, they might just be constantly consuming content focused on something else that they really want to bring to the fore. So how did you gain the buy-in and commitment from the executives that this is the area we need to do, and get their acceptance to drive forward with that?
Ironically, Josh, and I feel bad doing this, but I come back to the clarity, right? What is AstraZeneca here to do? We were focused on, we wanted to change the curve of cancer. If you're diagnosed to death, we wanted it to be this, not, the likelihood of death. And that has nothing to do with the environment. Now, the environment can impact the increase of cancer situations, right? Incidence of cancer, but we weren't causing that. What we were is bending the curve, right? And so as soon as I started to say we have to get focused, and the other thing is we have to tell the stakeholders, we will not take bad water and pour it into the rivers. We understand our duty, but don't come asking us to do more than what we are capable of doing. It's what's happened recently with the SEC around Scope 3. Scope 3 predominantly just allows a lot of consultants to do estimates. It's not the action required where Scope 1 and 2 is. And so that's what I keep, I did it at AstraZeneca. So when executives started hearing me say, focus, but you must then communicate and explain that focus. And the transparency of why you're doing that. Again, you're not enforcing to your stakeholders, love us. You're empowering them to make the decision if they want to love you or not. And that is the essence of everything I try to do. And it's why I ended up writing Trust in Action. Because I was meeting with board members, people were reaching out to me, and I realized everyone was stuck because no one knew a path forward. No one could get out of the rut of that white noise. When you think about the timing we've gone through, everything from Black Lives Matter to the Ukraine, the Gaza, the concerns going on in Asia now, on the reunification of China. And I could keep going, but I didn't even get into the climate concerns of the erratic, powerful weather that's happening. That's the new norm, right? Yeah. That white noise is paralyzing to leaders, and people keep trying to enforce instead of empower them to take the action needed. So what happens when you enforce and you're paralyzed? There's no action. So my goal is to change that human behavior, find where you can make the greatest impact, control it, and do it. It's that simple for me.
And then what about with the employees? You mentioned about the huge work that you were doing on the tree planting front, but cultivating that engagement takes time, and of course you may have an approach which is to listen and to empower, but you alone can't. You can't, of course, in a global organization, you can't do it all. So what strategies did you find effective in being able to mobilize the ability for employees to actually take those sustainable actions and create the sustainable outcomes?
Josh, ironically, I want to be very clear, I can't, but empowering my team, any one executive has capacity at 200 leaders. There's science around this human behavior of networks, right? So even though you're a CEO, you can say, we will never do this again. But outside of 200, someone will do it again, right? It's just we don't have that control. So as soon as you accept that you don't rule the world, right, you start to understand how to influence it better. And so by leveraging my network, I had a network of my sustainability colleagues around the world that I would reach out to and say, hey, can you find a source for this? But then also the power of technology. I had the internal social media where I could just do a post and it went out to all 60,000 employees. I ended up garnering the largest following in a community that I called, that was focused on the Lead for Health, where I had over 30,000 followers within the enterprise of about 55,000 employees. And so by doing one post and, having my team see their answers, we could start to respond. So it is amazing how leveraging, again, that Martech's law, technology is changing so rapidly. The ways in which we think executives communicate and it cascades. That's been blown up. So I can go on LinkedIn or my internal social media and communicate with the employees who are engaged. And that's how you start to develop the network that you can start to influence. The 200 quickly then goes exponential. And so that's how I encourage leaders to get out of their C-suite, get out of their traditional. And, one final thing I'll say is I started going to the canteen and looking for people sitting by themselves and looking for people who didn't look like me. And I would ask if I could sit down. 9 out of 10 times, they would always say yes. And I could have conversations. Many times they didn't know me because I wasn't at that facility. And sure. Just having conversations, then I would introduce myself and I'd talk about what I was doing and why I was doing this. Guess what? Engagement would take place, all because I needed to have lunch.
Sure. What was the 1 out of 10 that said no?
After we're working on a project, right? It's like, no, I'm just sitting here like, okay, not a problem. Or they were waiting for someone else. And, it's like, who's this guy? I mean, let's be honest. They saw the corn-fed Missouri like, no, I don't need you sitting here. And I don't blame them. They were the real winners, Josh.
Yeah, exactly. So it sounds like you were having huge impact, success there. The programs were working really well. You'd cultivated this following. What was it that prompted you to then take that move? Because I suppose for lots of people I talked to, they would have built a place where actually they felt really comfortable and would have seen that out. So what prompted and forced you to make that change?
I'm a transformer. I when I'm comfortable, I'm uncomfortable. And so I literally had overhauled the governance for the company, transformatively so. I had overhauled, through Access to Medicine Index, our ranking and our performance, being one of the first companies to transparently talk about tiered pricing. We had groundbreaking work. We were the first corporate sponsor for Healthy Planet, Healthier People with the UN. For SDG 3, we were the first corporate sponsor for that. And then on the environment side, once I had commitment and fully funded, Bloomberg in 2020 acknowledged AstraZeneca's environmental plan as the most robust, funded, and transparent environmental program of any publicly traded company. So at that point, it's about execution. And sure. I'm not the best at getting, I can inspire people, but my magic is in strategy and collecting dots to help organizations connect them. So I needed something more to be fulfilled because I couldn't just sit and watch it implement when I knew so many other companies were behind the 8 ball. So I had that sense of urgency to go do.
So what did you do?
So I transitioned. I went to, and this is again another thing, I believe one of the biggest moments of our time is the frontier of connecting the United States and China, two of the world's mega powers, and figuring out how to navigate that space. And so someone in my network said, hey, I'm getting all these questions about this ESG stuff. Isn't that what you were talking about at that conference? I'm like, yeah. And she was like, can you help me out with this? I'm like, of course. So, the first couple of calls, I'm like, listen, just do this. And she's like, hey, we need to bring you in because I'm not doing this, and she just, she is a brilliant leader who has all the agility, but she was trying to figure out, how to build the compliance program. And so now she could easily do it. Right. But, they brought me into Zai as the chief sustainability officer. And I always say it was fascinating because I started my career at Johnson & Johnson, an icon within the U.S. that went out to the world. Then I worked at AstraZeneca, which is now, I think it's a FTSE 1, right? I think it may be the largest company in AstraZeneca. And so, I worked at Johnson & Johnson where the U.S. way was the global way. Then I worked at AstraZeneca where the UK at the time EU way was the way. And so I'm like, it'd be fascinating to work for a company with a primary focus from Asia and see what does that feel like looking back. And I'll tell you, some of the most corporate growth I've ever experienced is in this role, navigating the polarization of two superpowers that don't trust each other and trying to understand the obligations from both countries so that we can still meet the need of our patients where we have our greatest impact. And that's why when I went to work there, I just written my book, Trust in Action. And ironically, the program, when we did our materiality, we realized our biggest issue was we were China, US, and we were biotech pharma. We had a trust issue. And so our program is called Trust for Life, where we have our greatest impact is in human life. And we need everyone to trust us to do that part of why we exist.
Sure, I understand. If you were to sort of summarize some of the key challenges that you face, not you've explained some of the organizational challenges, but you personally in stepping, from west to east, as it were, US, UK, and then into an Asian focused company, I suppose, or fundamentals. What were some of just the general things that you realized and recognized that were different, perhaps in the way of working or the understanding that you needed to perhaps just slightly shift your mindset or way of working to deliver within?
I think the first, if you don't mind, I'll talk about my own personal leadership struggle. No one knew the company I was with. I had gone from Johnson & Johnson to AstraZeneca to people saying ZAI, is that Zay? Not even knowing how to pronounce the company. And, having come off some of the world's, global thought leader things to why are you doing this? It didn't make sense was a tough identity challenge for me. Right. Because it goes back to, I did it because my gut told me it was the right thing to do. It was, bringing innovation from east to west is okay. It's not just, poor China, they need our brilliance. There's a lot of innovation going on there in the science community. And so there aren't a lot of products coming this direction. And so with the work I've done in diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's, understanding the colonization of so much of what I've experienced in the world. Even when I was a rural kid in Missouri, what if we changed that a little bit? And so it's just really challenging myself. So that was a major struggle. One of the interesting things for me is understanding the bias. Everyone views ESG sustainability as a European, maybe a US, but Asia doesn't care. And I'll tell you, people keep thinking of regional aspects, but they're forgetting the generational. And so there's a certain age group, and I would say it's under age 25, of which in China, we have a very young working population at our company. And those employees know these issues. And it is on the agenda for China. They are wanting to be the leaders in green energy. They're wanting to be leaders in healthcare. So the areas where this company is wanting to focus is an important piece of that. And so
Sure.
Helping my Western colleagues understand that we aren't outliers, that yes, these colleagues, they're pulling this as much as we are. So access to talent, having a good ESG sustainability strategy in China allows us to maintain access to the talent in China. It's not just talent in Europe and the US, but those misconceptions are there that they don't care. And anytime I hear they, versus the specifics, I start saying bias, and that triggers. So that's a challenge for me that I continue to have. And then the other is just the nuance of getting lost in ESG or human rights. I have to get specific on what is it we're talking about, because if we stay up here in the white noise of acronyms, we don't get the action we need. But when I get specific, I can implement the very controls we need to ensure the business is getting done the way all stakeholders expect.
Sure. So from going to AstraZeneca and leading with health and that being the key focus for the sustainability journey to have impact, what would you say that that's looked like in the current firm? And has that altered, or because it's similar sector, it's the same?
It's very similar. One of the things that I keep trying to help organizations do, and I was able, both organizations I've been at, I've been able to do this, right, is accept when you do discovery of a novel molecule, you're meeting your S aspect. This is where your social impact is having, because it's SDG 3. Even here at Xi, it's a challenge. I'm like, so what is our target number of people we want to impact? And initially people are like, well, we don't know. And I'm like, well, how did you come up with the long range risk adjusted forecast? I'm like, well, we have projections on patients. I'm like, that's the number. If you can attribute it to dollar, that number that you factor into the equation is the number that we want to impact and reach by a certain standpoint. So it sounds so basic, Josh, but again, no one's ever communicated. The investors have never said, we worry about the number of patients that are in the equation for the dollar that we're happy with. So just understanding how to connect it has been fascinating. And I've gotten to do that at Xi. And I now have a deep passion for small to medium enterprises because I get to do it right from the start. At AstraZeneca, I had to overhaul centuries of practices where here, for example, my CEO is Dr. Samantha Du. And one of her legacies is her leadership as a female CEO. And so one of the important things is making sure we have equity in leadership. And it's not just having women in leadership roles, but making sure they're paid equally, a major topic. With the growth we've had, we now have a commitment, and Raters and Rankers have struggled with it because we are the only company saying this today, that we will maintain leadership and pay equity at all levels. Like, yeah, but what's your goal? I'm like, no, we have it. We annually show you that we have 50% of women, VP, director, manager, individual contributors, and they are paid equal to men. We aren't trying to get there like all the other companies you're looking at. We're maintaining it, and here's our data. And it's still, I get questions about, but yes, how are you going to get more? I'm like, we're not going to get more because we're at 51% of women in VP, which we consider executive roles, and they're paid equally. So, we have to maintain balance. Now we need to start looking at other socio factors. But for now, we're going with the ones that is global because DE&I in the US looks very different than it does in China.
For sure, yes. And something that comes through from talking to you, I suppose, is around the importance of purpose and staying true to your own values and principles. What advice would you give to aspiring sustainability leaders, or I suppose any leader, but who's navigating their career path with purpose, as they hit these roadblocks where perhaps those ethics or morals or even their own purpose gets put into question slightly?
Understand and don't allow a system to make you do something you're not willing to do. I think I'm always very careful because through my identity, the systems were built for me. So it's much easier for me to navigate as I'm trying to transform those systems. But I think, it's always important. There have been many times when I felt that my purpose was being sacrificed because I did not understand the full story. I didn't understand. They weren't telling me no ever. It was no, not this week. And so, it's understanding the role you may have, but then understanding the intentions from the other stakeholder. And if it truly is, this isn't going to happen here. We so easily, and I did this a lot early on in my career, assume this is end all be all. If I leave, there's no hope for me. And I can tell you, there are tons of organizations that need exactly what you want to do, and they will pay you to do it. And so it's always, instead of playing victim and thinking, woe is me, the system's holding me back, just check in, clarify before you take on the battle. But also, if you find out that there will be no movement, don't stay. Why? The urgency for the change we need, no matter what someone's wanting to change, I know it needs to happen. So if you can't do it there, reach out to me, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll help you find wherever it is because I know that change has to happen anyway.
For sure. And what are your hopes, if we sort of look forward now then, what are your hopes and aspirations for the future of sustainability and leadership, or sustainability leadership, not just within, I suppose, Zylab, but across all industries and society as a whole?
I want people to understand what we're talking about. I want them to get beyond the acronym to understand its meaning. And I know sustainability is not an acronym, but in my space, people often will shorten it to ESG. They'll often shorten it to DE&I. There's all these things. And so it's getting focused on the activity itself that needs to take place, the best way to do it. And, I write a lot about it's important to understand it for yourself. It's important to understand it for your teams, but then you must also understand it for the system as the earth and world itself, because it interplays at all those levels. And, one thing that I write about in Trust in Action is transformation doesn't start at the system. It actually starts within ourselves. We must first transform ourselves to transform our teams to transform the world. And I think that's the legacy I want to build. And what I'm trying to do is not be beholden to one company, but help as many companies as I can find why they are there, transform, and when I talk about self could be a company. A company can transform itself to transform its industry to transform the world. And so I now understand my transformation and that I was born to build. And so I am out here trying to find organizations that want to transform. I will help them build it, but I will no longer be beholden to one company, because when the company has me there, everyone comes to me. My job is to build the capacity and capability that empowers those leaders to take action without me. And so that's my goal and the legacy I want to create.
For sure. Understood. So this almost sounds as though the question is of the system that's in more recent years been created with the rise of the Chief Sustainability Officer and the function of sustainability overall. And I know you have a perspective on that. So perhaps you could share a bit about what that looks like for the future and perhaps the new model of how that could be positioned within organizations.
Yes. I think I don't want to pick on the Chief Sustainability Officer. I'm going to pick on multiple C-suite positions. I think an organization probably needs a CEO. We need a CFO. Probably need a head of development, R&D, research development, product development, maybe someone in charge of commercial, maybe a head people person. But sometimes there's a C-suite of 12, 13, 14 people. And what I'm finding is that inflammation of C-suite is actually harming the accountability of the head leader. And so for me, what I see the benefit of is a fractional role. And what got me thinking about this is when I was at AstraZeneca, I had a big team. I had 75 people on my global team, and they were subject matter experts. And there were times when I wasn't maximizing their passion, their purpose. And, I had carbon experts who, 2 weeks a quarter would need to analyze our footprint. But then what else was happening with their invaluable time when so many companies needed that? So that's got me thinking about that fractional work is how do we keep people doing their best work, the most of the time giving them the joy they need while meeting the demands of the world? And that's what I'm finding is, I officially in May will be going fractional with my company at Zai. I built the strategy. They brought me in. I built the strategy. I built the capacity and capability within the various functions. So now when they need me, I'm there. But when they don't, I'm out helping others because we all share the global system that needs fixing. And so instead of wasting time just going to meetings and doing those things that you get sucked into, I'm being intentional with the time, trying to help more companies scale faster because we are in crises across all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals.
Sure. So with that model, I suppose, and the lack of time that you have in comparison to a full-time individual, or maybe even somebody who can look at it as a longer-term thing than a fixed period of time, What's your couple of top tips for people who are going into organizations to do that? If somebody's thinking, actually, that route sounds interesting, but I'm used to working in an organization where I've had 10 years to make this change. If you've only got 12 months, what would be some of the practical things that you would be thinking about on your agenda in those early days to try to create that effect that you're needed to do?
Curiosity and learning are going to be a key factor, right? Because what we can't do is go company to company with off-the-shelf solutions. What I do is curate highly customized programs based on the board and executive team's mission, pressure from stakeholders, but then also taking cues from the culture, right? The culture of Zai Lab is drastically different than the culture of AstraZeneca, which was drastically different than Johnson & Johnson. And so there's no, and I think that's the other thing I'm trying to bring to light here is often, the average small to medium sized organization has a CSO, then they have 1 to 3 team members. So then that means everything is already then being outsourced to consultants. And what I find is consultants just keep selling off the shelf totality soup to nuts, these big projects. What I do is I come in and say, hey, listen, I've done the gap analysis. So save the $50,000 price tag on that gap analysis. We don't have anything. I'm going to tell you what I need you to build and with whom you're going to build it. Get going. And so, that's where, I have modeled this out, and I see these fractional models with curiosity and learning and customization save money, save time, and increase the speed to impact. And so that's why I think it's an important piece is it's customizable versus just you need an environmental plan. Here's our net zero plan. You pay us this amount and we will get you to net zero. That may not be what the organization needs at this point in time. Yes, they need a science-based target, but we cannot get to net zero in a scope 3. And I'm tired of us pretending that we can until major transformation happens in the 20 industries that are driving 90% of the greenhouse gas. So instead of giving a calculation, I'm going to tell you what we're doing to minimize our footprint. And I will also tell you where we're making our dent.
And of course, we discussed this before, sustainability is the value creation tool that can actually boost both, the organization in terms of the purpose, but also the long term, the commercial return can be there. But of course, in the short term, there can be conflicts between what some see as purpose-driven initiatives or sustainability and driving, the profit margins that perhaps investors are looking for. How do you balance that issue that maybe the senior executives, the CEOs may be seeing as conflicting objectives where they're being really probably looked at by their previous year earning results, and this year they're not, investors might not be looking 5 years down the pathway. How do you engage with that?
Well, we're running into that, right? With publicly traded companies, with small to medium private equity, you have a small group of people that just want to get their money, sell, and get out. And that's a challenge. The good news is we're seeing more and more stakeholders, and I keep coming back to this, access to talent, access to capital. Plenty of people are asking, what are you doing? And so that's how I keep addressing it, is there will be a time when investors will start to look at you and say, you haven't started to address environment, you're going to have to start spending. So you may give me profit this year, but over the next 5 years, when the world's expecting this, you're going to have to spend. So it's going to go down. So I need to find some others who've already done this. So that's where being myopic too short term will end up hurting the long-term financial viability of an organization, in my humble opinion. Mm-hmm. And so that's where, though, I don't know how much you are aware of this. I think you're very savvy. I'll be shocked if you don't know this. But in the U.S., we have 3 major states. We have we call them red and blue states. Florida and Texas are pushing ESG as the woke, liberal, stay away from. But then we have California, a blue state, that's saying push, push, push. California, generally speaking, for consumer packaged good companies, represent about 25% of their U.S. sales. And so though Texas and Florida are trying to push, companies are having to meet the requirements of California because they need access to those dollars from the consumer revenue side. Florida and Texas are coming from, we'll kick you out of our retirement plans. You won't be an option for that. So, even with all of that, I just keep coming back to the California piece. Do you want to hurt top line, or do you not want to, do you want to limit your investors? Because there are plenty of investors around the world in other areas. And so that's how I keep advising my corporate stakeholders in this complex space of thinking longer term than just quarterly results.
For sure. So with this move to the fractional, the fractional route, and I suppose having greater impact, it sounds like you've got a clear definition in your mind of what that needs to look like. I think I explained to you at the beginning, the purpose of this podcast is to talk to individuals who lead with impact and want to have that at the end of their career. So when you consider that and you think towards the end of your career, what you would like to be able to look back on with your legacy, and of course you've already done so much, but from here forwards, perhaps to really show that you've left the world better than you found it, what would you like that to be?
I think for me, I will rest well when I know that leaders are trusting themselves to do what it is they need to do. And so it's not going to be something that you see on a regular basis or people who don't know me are going to see, but it's going to be the executives I'm working with that I help transform them to transform their organizations, to transform the world. So no one's ever going to know Jim Massey did that, but I will. And that's all I need.
For sure. Absolutely. I think that rings true. And is a noble cause, which I'm sure you've already achieved, but I'm sure you will continue to in this new position. So, is there anything else that you think is relevant to share at the moment in terms of the industry, where it's going? Any tips that you would like to give before we close out?
I think that when we talk industry, I'm going to talk about the sustainability industry. I think I'm going to keep coming back to, we always should have been focused. There was this time when, and again, it goes back to this Martech's law, Josh, right? The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were written for countries. When we saw that the countries were not fulfilling, business tried to fill that void. I still believe business plays a critical role, but one business can't address all 17. And that's why you have to keep focusing on where you're going to make the biggest dent in this world. And so by focusing, that's going to help companies. And I predict you're going to see over time more and more companies coming out. And why I talk about trust in action so much is everyone always says trust is if you do what you say you will. That's actually just one element. There are three foundations of trust. The one is can and capability. Can you do what you say you're going to do? Because you may not have the capability. So that's why mine is focus. Find the one thing you can do and focus on that. The other is caring. The reason people don't trust so many organizations and governments is they don't believe they have their best interest at heart. And so that's why I think it's important you communicate. So when you communicate why you exist, I can do this, and I'm doing this because it impacts you this way. I hear you, I see you. And if you want me to do this, I'm not, and here's why. You start to build trust. And then the final element is what 9 out of 10 people see is us walking our talk. And that's the do. So can, care, do is how I take my strategy in sustainability. I think we're going to see more of that as we continue to evolve and find the crises that we face on a regular basis.
Thank you very much for sharing that. It's extremely insightful. I would love to be able to share your details with the audience. I'm sure there's people who are listening to this thinking, would love to talk to Jim about a particular topic, or maybe even just to network and engage, maybe even facing challenges that you've described today that they'd like your viewpoint on. Are you happy for people to connect with you and engage about this?
100%. The easiest way is to connect with me on LinkedIn. When you share and post this, I'll make sure to, tag me in the post, and that way people can follow and reach out directly. And then they can also go to www.jimmassey.co, and that is my website, and reach out to me via that way as well.
Excellent. Well, we'll have to do a check-in maybe a year or two into the fractional CSO route to see how it's going. I'm sure in a couple of years' time, given the rate of transformation, it will be something that sounds like old news now, and it might be something that's transformed again. But I can clearly see the role and remit there. We at GS2 have organizations that are coming to us to ask for this type of talent. So it's certainly the trend and the way it's going. So let's check in. Let's keep in contact.
I'd even offer it's exactly what you do. It's what you do for HR, right? For HR functions looking for talent, you provide that fractional expertise to get the right people because of the expertise your organization has. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm following in your footsteps, and we'll follow up in a year's time.
Exactly. Good. So let's do that. But it's been an absolute pleasure to have you today. So thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to hearing how it all goes for you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Better Than We Found It. I hope you have found value from this to support your own purpose-led journey. This episode was brought to you by GS2 Partnership, my organisation focused on providing talent solutions for sustainably focused organisations. We are driven by our purpose of connecting the people who believe in leaving the world better than we found it. If you are looking for a partner to support you with your hiring plans, or you are looking for your own career next steps, please reach out to us or personally drop me a message on LinkedIn. It's great to hear from listeners to the podcast, and I would welcome the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you very much, and stay tuned for our next episode.